All right. So you can see that I'm in a oddly lit room that is not my studio. I'm in DC this week, doing stuff to hopefully help my brother out and other people in the same situation. And in the meantime, another summer of drawing continues. So pardon a couple of things this week. One is the rather low quality imagery for the artwork that I've drawn because I've been trying to take photos in a dimly lit hotel room to use in the class. Hopefully, I can substitute those when I get back to Chappie with uh, some higher quality images, and I will probably send the PDF out late, as in this weekend, because of that, so that you guys can actually see what we're doing. But there's nothing to worry about. Today, what we're going to be doing is actually sort of another audition. We're going to be working through kind of not so much a technique, but sort of a stylistic way to approach really busy subject matter. And I'm hoping that this will be another sort of relaxing, although you'll have to think your way through. Um, we're not going to be trying to, produce a beautiful finished piece of artwork, but this will definitely be a plan whereby you can produce a beautiful piece of artwork. The theme is what we're going to be doing today is trying not to draw rather than to draw. So let me explain all of that. We'll get started. I can't get used to being at the wrong height with this crazy little hotel table, but at least we can do it. Okay, let me get started here. Okay. This is so cool. Another summer of drawing, class number 17 on the theme of home. I can't believe I came up with this many ideas, and there are actually, far more besides. But this week, the idea is transplant. And we're going to use the following image today to come up with a drawing. So, how does this relate to home? Well, the idea to me was, a lot of people, we don't grow up and live our entire lives in the village or town or city that we were necessarily born in. We become transplants for one reason or another, sometimes to different parts of town, sometimes different parts of a state, the country, or even the world. We might move around several times during the course of our life. So I liked this idea of home being, sort of wherever you make it, and that when you go there, you have to find a way to become a part of the community, to grow in your new atmosphere, and that could happen several times. Likewise, your children could be doing the same thing. They could be transplanting themselves to other locations. So that could all come with some very negative connotations as well. There's some transplanting that you don't do voluntarily, for example. But I decided for this week, we're going to go with the idea of hope and growth. In general, a peaceful and not an agitated interpretation of the idea of home, and that one becomes settled and tries to grow wherever you are. Now, I'm sure that looking at this particular image today, you're thinking to yourself, excuse me, Elizabeth, you just told us it was going to be relaxing and that we weren't going to be drawing a lot. And now you give me this image full of stuff. But that's exactly why I have done it. We're often presented with scenes like this. And not only that, whereas this photo kind of crops things down to a small extent, if we were sitting out in the garden and looking at this, we would be seeing far more, foliage, possibly trees, bushes, sky, and trying to figure out how to zero in on the scene can be really difficult. So we'll be talking a little bit about that today. Of course, back to my previous classes, a viewfinder helps you, establish the scene. But what if you're trying to figure that out in relation to a concept, like the concept of home, and trying to figure out, okay, we've got obviously some plants that have been transplanted. We have this nice little scene, watering can, and that kind of thing. How much other stuff has to go in there in order for us to carry off this drawing? All right, so as we have been doing in the last few classes, observation being so important, how to interpret the scene. So what are we going to draw? Um, Even though the watering can really doesn't have anything to do with transplanting per se, apart from perhaps being able to interpret that as part of the growth. I love it. It's a great shape. So it's going in the drawing. The plants and pots, obviously, that represents the transplanting. some of the bricks, some of the foliage, and I liked those scissors. Just, if you took them out, if you hold your finger up and kind of block the scissors out, it kind of loses something. Those scissors really work in there. So even though they really don't have a lot to do, you'd have to sort of stretch your interpretation to figure out how the story includes the scissors. But from a design point of view, they look great. So I think we keep them in there. So the last few classes, we've been concentrating really hard on how we can vary the pencil type, the stroke direction, the beveled lead, the academic pointy, the, mechanical pencil, whatever else you have on hand to help draw something like this. But in this particular case, what we're going to be trying to do, we don't really have any like whites. We have a lot of darks, a ton of mid-tone, a ton of light tones. This is a perfect place to go through this exercise of showing how everything doesn't have to be colored in. Now, like I said, what we're going to be doing today, don't feel like you've got to do it perfectly. We're just auditioning this whole approach. Do what you can with the idea that you're going to apply this over and over again to different subject matters. Let me show you what we're going to do. So to begin with, first, we're just going to concentrate on this segment that's closest to the ideas or the objects around transplant. So that's the plants in the two pots, the scissors, the watering can, few of the bricks and a few of the foliage. However, I'm not going to crop this image down for you to work from because, what I found was I actually pulled some stuff that's over on the left-hand side in a little closer. You might want to do the same, move things around, or just you might want to see the scene in total because if you were sitting outside, that's actually what you would see. Whoops. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right. We're going to do the No 10 next. I almost forgot how we were doing the class. So even though this is complicated, and even though I'm going to show you ways to make it less complicated, let's just start off with trying to deal with the complexity through the No 10. So I'd like you to spend a few minutes just drawing a small image about, 1.5 by 2 inches, something like that, where all you're looking at is you're starting to explore the patterns of light and dark and figure out kind of for yourself how far is your drawing going to go. Now, I found this really challenging when I did it. I started off with the watering can. That was an easy shape to kind of define. I did find I needed to sort of draw a few things. And then I was like, well, what's going to be dark and what's going to be light? It started to become a real problem to figure it out. There are some definite darks in this image, but most of them are further to the outside away from the main part of the scene. So I had to start making it up. And this is what I'm imagining you guys are going to be going through right now. There are too many lights and darks scattered right around now. And I was like, well, okay, I need to kind of pull all of that together. I'm going to have to change the intensity, perhaps, of some of these lights and darks. But how am I going to do that? So one thing that I did, which I actually ended up changing later on, was I made one of the plants a dark. But for this No 10, it worked really, quite well. I was like, okay, yeah, that can be dark because the mint leaves I see behind the watering can, those can end up being light. I've got some dark shapes behind the watering can that will work. The watering can be light. And so I started sort of working my way across doing this kind of decision making with the knowledge that in this case, in particular, of all of the things we've been drawing this summer, that some of the decisions we're going to have to change. Because, if I look at the little um, flower pot on the left, the smaller one, gosh, well, that's a dark that's almost the same darkness as the bricks behind. How am I going to do that? How is that going to work? So one of the kind of challenges I think with doing these no tens is that when you end up with a lot of stuff that is a middle value, you're kind of making decisions about whether you're going to shove it more into the lights or more into the darks. And what you do on your no 10 doesn't have to be where the drawing ends up. Sometimes it's just a matter of going, can I figure out a pattern of lights and darks that sort of would flow through this design? So I found myself changing a few things as I worked on the no 10 to make something lighter, something darker, knowing that, hey, this is just a first look, a first pass at this, trying to figure it out. But also going, okay, I do want to make sure that there are some darks that flow through my drawing and that there are some lights that flow through my drawing in some way. When I get to the final interpretation, if I haven't done that in this audition, and of course an audition just means we're going to try out a bunch of stuff, see how it works during the time that we have, because it will actually take the whole class to do this audition. Um, but then if I were to redraw this more carefully, I might even do another notan at the beginning and go, okay, some of my decisions were good and some of my decisions were not as workable as I might want them to be. The other, so while you're busy dealing with the challenges of what is light and what is dark and how is that actually going to work, you don't actually have to make this into a real little drawing and fix things that you see that are out of proportion, or in this case, for example, I didn't even draw the handle of the watering can in or anything in particular, because I'm just looking for the large shapes. And then you have to keep going back to, hey, even though I've got dark shapes over there on the left that are kind of interesting, I need to keep everything around the central focal point, which is the story. And this is exactly where photography lets us down when it comes to arts, and trying to use photographic reference to do something like this. And this is why I love going through the process of drawing and auditioning and sketching and roughs, even if I don't complete them, even if I just sort of do a bunch of them sequentially and don't ever get to a final drawing. It's because the camera treats everything across the board with equal importance. It's really not putting any more definition into the mint leaves behind the watering can than it is to the bean leaves that we see far out on the left. Unless we've got it out of focus, the camera treats it all as one big, evenly distributed picture. But we as artists can change all of that around. We can even change the relative lightness and darkness of objects so that we get a little bit of a flow and a pattern going on. I think there are a lot of very complex scenes that we come across that we would like to draw. And without the idea that we don't have to draw everything, I think it would be very daunting, because we're trying to figure out, well, how would I interpret all of those bricks with even with all the different pencil techniques and the types of pencils we have. So let's move on. So one of these things, I've been saying, we're not going to draw things today. What does that mean? So here are two examples. They are unfortunately taken in slightly different light. The paper on the right is not actually gray. It's both on white paper. It's actually the exact same drawing, but I just, on the right, added in all the color, as I call it, to the leaves. And on the left, I had left some of them lighter. And you can probably see that these have two completely different applications just because of changing those three leaves. On the left-hand side, you've got a lot more pop, and you notice those leaves, those three leaves in particular. Why is that? Because of contrast. I've been talking about how detail and contrast lead your eyes to something. So if I wanted to show that something was in the foreground, it was on top, it was more important, absolutely putting no definition or very little definition into the leaves would be the way that I do it. But we have a tendency to do more what's over on the right-hand side. Now, that's not a bad thing to do. Sometimes we actually don't want to draw attention to something. If we had a carpet of leaves and only two or three were to be shown, all the rest of the leaves we could treat by drawing all of them in a way, with perhaps similar tones or whatever. So it just becomes a blanket of leaves. And that's a very useful technique. But if we actually wanted to pull your eye to certain places, what are we going to do if we've already started drawing everything in? What we're going to end up with is a situation where we get darker and darker and add more pencil and more pencil and get very frustrated and don't get to where we want. So the idea is that from the start, and even though you go back and lift things up with an eraser, the idea is from the start to leave things completely uncolored. And so likewise, so over here on the right-hand side, I have that image that we just saw. And then over here on the left, I have a similar example, which could be done, for example, with the scene that we're doing today, where you have something such as there is a tomato plant on the lower left in this particular scene, where you really like that object. You think it's fun and interesting and you want to pull it into your scene. But if you actually try to draw it, you'll end up with a very dark and kind of messy looking plant in the lower left hand side, which is not differentiated at all from the bricks behind it. So this is where, and you'll start to see this, David Hockney does this a lot, for example. There are other artists that we've looked at over the few years where I've pointed out at various different times. Notice how there's, for example, no detail to a trunk on a tree, but the other trees have detail, and that makes the one that doesn't have anything drawn in it really stand out. So this is just a really useful technique. I find that when I'm drawing like this, from a technical point of view, I want to draw the plant a little bit wider and thicker all the way around and the leaves a little bit bigger than they actually are in real life. And this is because when this is from a technical point of view, when you go ahead and add in the background drawing to begin with, if you're not so careful, you might end up sort of minimizing the amount of white that's shown anyway. And it's difficult sometimes, depending on the size you're working at, to lift out with an eraser the white shapes. But also what happens is that when you draw with a pencil stroke, there is actually a width to that pencil stroke. There's an outside edge and an inside edge. What you actually see once you've darkened in the background is only the inside edge. So if you were to draw the line kind of exactly covering the edge of what you wanted to draw, the visible area afterwards, it would actually be smaller, if that makes any sense. So when you're drawing something like this, that you're going to have just that you're just going to leave blank, you actually want basically the inside of the width of the line you're drawing to be on the outside of the object, if that makes sense. It will make your life a lot easier. You can always make those stems and leaves smaller and more narrow. It is harder to go the other way. Let me just say it like that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started on the drawing today. And all we're going to do for the entire class is work our way through this particular image. Now, I don't have larger versions for you to see of what's going on. I'm just going to explain to you, what I did. So at this point, we're going to do what we do every single time, which is to start off just out with outlines, kind of drawing everything that you see in the scene that you might want to include. And this is the time, of course, of checking the angles, checking your ovals and such. And what I did for the plants, and you might have to kind of look close at the screen to see, was I just sort of ran my pencil very loosely. I kind of trailed my pencil around the outside edges of the plant in total, not of each leaf and everything, but just sort of to get the general shape of how the plant worked. I included that little tomato plant that's down on the left-hand side because I just liked that. And then I saw some interesting things like a little Queen Anne's lace that was going on over on the right behind the watering can. And then, the general shape of the mint leaves doesn't have to be detailed. But what's more important, and where I started when I did this drawing, because there's a lot going on here, I started with the watering can, and I started with the angle of the left-hand side of the watering can. And I said, let me get that one line right. So as you're drawing, I'm going to keep pointing out things that we've actually talked about through the course of the classes this year. And the first one of those is this idea that you start with what you see first, what's most obvious. To me, that watering can is the easiest thing to look at, the easiest thing to see. And picking those big lines that show me the two sides of the watering can seemed really obvious. And also, if you get a couple of things right like that up front, you feel a lot better about yourself. You're like, okay, I'm in process. So almost immediately, you then run into the problem. How big is this watering can going to be? So what I did was I established the top. I decided, okay, I'm going to make the top oval. And then I held up my pencil and I measured the angle from the top left-hand side of the kind of where the opening is on the watering can, and figured out where that meant my watering can bottom had to be. I couldn't let it go longer. I couldn't have it be shorter. So just kind of drawing an X, doing it the same from the other side, upper left-hand side of the top of the watering can, figured out where the bottom should be on the other side. And then those were the endpoints of the oval that created the bottom of the watering can. Likewise, when I measured the angle for the spout, not only did I look at the angle for the spout, I also looked at where it then bisected the oval that made the bottom of the watering can. It's almost halfway across. So that allowed me to put the watering can spout immediately at about the right height, because that's the kind of thing that's very difficult. When I wanted to figure out how tall the spout was, I just held up my pencil and I looked at where it kind of hit based on the top of the watering can. And that kind of told me where to stop the spout. So these things for today don't have to be perfectly exact, but uh, there's never a problem with just sort of practicing how this works and just using those, holding up your pencil, checking the angle, looking at how that same angle looks on your page. Did you get it right? It's really important. The other thing that is really useful, this is an extremely good example of this business about how ovals and circles change in perspective. So where we are, where our eye view is, we are above, like our eye level is above this photograph. We are looking down on everything. We know that because we can see the tops of the bricks. We can see into the top of the plant pots. We can see into the top of the watering can. And we can't see anything from below. We can't see the bottom of the bricks, can't see the bottom of anything. That tells us immediately that all of the circles that we see, which present themselves to us as ovals because they're not at eye level, they're not flat, they're going down more, they're getting more and more circular as they're going down towards our feet. Because if that circle was like a plate that we saw down by our feet, it would look quite circular. As we would hold that plate and move it up towards our eye level, we see less and less of the plate. It becomes a flatter and flatter oval. So the same thing is happening with the top and the bottom of the watering can. If we were to continue the circle of the oval, which I actually did on my sketch first and then I erased it, for the bottom of the watering can, it would be much more circular of an oval, much rounder and fatter than the oval that we use for the top of the watering can, which is going to be a lot skinnier of an oval, much flatter. Likewise, the same exact thing is going to happen over on the flower pots. The circle that we see that is the opening where the soil is of the bigger flower pot is actually going to be less circular than the smaller bottom of the flower pot that we can't see. So this takes practice to get used to looking at, to seeing, observing, and also to drawing. And I find it really useful if I'm drawing a bunch of things like this that are going to have ovals in perspective, basically circles in perspective that we're looking at, kind of like plates that are moving in front of us, that it's useful for me to go ahead and draw the complete circle or oval and then double check. Does this make sense, in perspective? Do I have the oval at the bottom flatter than the one at the top, which would be weird? That it wouldn't actually work like that in perspective. So even just with drawing two flower pots and a watering can, you're already dealing with all of that perspective stuff that comes into play. There are other items like this that you would, take into account. For example, things like the bricks and such. Now, what happens with these bricks? Every single one of them is in a different position. That means each one of them basically has a different vanishing point. If we were to take lines off the sides of each one going in each different direction, they're all different. So I'm not a person who suggests, making up a grid and drawing stuff out. You would end up with grid lines all over your drawing that would be quite crazy. However, if you find that when you are drawing the bricks that they aren't working, one really useful tool is to go ahead and draw the brick out like a little block right on your drawing and go, okay, if I were to follow that line and it goes this way and the bottom of the brick line goes that way, eventually they should, meet out there somewhere in the distance. Is that actually what I'm seeing? Does that perspective work? Do I have a horizon line that might be way off the side of the picture going one way and a horizon line going way off the picture on the other side that actually makes some sense? Because when you're drawing something really complex like this, those bricks can start wobbling around basically. Now you'll notice in my sketch, I haven't actually drawn a lot of bricks. I decided that, okay, I wanted to get into how, draw some of this foliage, let my, pencil kind of wander around the edge. And then I'm a little bit shy of the bricks, I can see very much that I'd really love to start drawing them all. And I'm afraid that, with the time and the drawing we're trying to do, that I would get really complex. So I decided I did actually draw them out more as blocks, more as rectangles. And then I took my eraser before I went on to the next step. And as you can see here, I erased out on the bricks a number of lines and just left myself some hints of where some of those intersections happened, and where some of those lines were. So your eraser really is your best friend, from this point onwards. Um, you're when at the beginning of the drawing, you can draw lines wherever you want, erase them. Softer paper like those Reeves papers that I was using over the last few weeks are a little difficult to do that with. You kind of do need a plan. But today I'm back to using the Artistico Fabriano hot press watercolor paper that I enjoy drawing on. I tend to use the side that has less is less rough. Probably the side that many watercolor artists wouldn't use, but I think it's really good for drawing. So that allows me to do a decent amount of erasing, which is really useful. So I'll just give you a few more minutes at this point. I am going to grab a swig of coffee, especially now that I went to the effort of crawling around on the floor of the hotel room making the cup of coffee. I was telling people before the class started that obviously I'm in a hotel room this week, and in order to clear the clutter out from behind me, I had to move the coffee pot. Only then to realize I actually wanted a cup of coffee before class started. So that is one well-deserved cup. All right, I'm going to move us on to the next step because I'm sure some of you are wondering what we do next. So next, we kind of do what we tend to do a lot in drawing class, which is pull in some of those darks, where and try to start thinking about where does the detail need to go. So before I actually start drawing at this point, I do tend to go, okay, I've got my general, sketch that I had before. Um, and I don't want to start filling in foliage. We're trying to do that just like I showed you in the early examples. We're trying to do that style where we leave things open, where we don't fill everything in. But it's really tempting because I'm like, oh, I could put the stems in of some of those transplants, or I could add a little bit more to the tomato. There's all of this stuff that you see that you think you could, start to do. So there's no doubt when you start in on this, the first thing you're going to do is what you always do, your normal kind of go-to drawing method. There's nothing wrong with that. I just want you to show a little bit of restraint and try not to draw too much in unless you really know that you want some dark areas or you want some. So on the watering can, I started to add in some reflection, some of the dark shading I saw. I saw that the grasses behind, maybe I wouldn't fill in the grasses. Maybe I would just sort of go, well, what if I just did some shapes here to represent the darkness? Likewise, on the mint behind, I'm like, okay, well, I could define the shape a little bit by throwing some dark behind the mint, kind of like I see in the photo. And I can see I need some darks on the sides of the flower pots. Um, for sure, I can make the scissors dark. And I'd like to, maybe put a little definition down there behind the tomato plant. Even though there isn't that much dark down there, I just want that because I like it and I want to show the tomato plant. So I'm going to do that. So the tools I tended to use mostly for this were actually the beveled pencil lead because I could do it relatively quickly. And I used an HB. Now, the for the audition purposes and trying to get you something for the class, that worked really well. It's a little dark, actually. I think if I'm going to do a more careful version of this, I'll probably back that off and do maybe a 2H or an H as my first pass, because it's really easy to start putting too much graphite down. But for what I was up to today, I wanted to get really quickly to sort of some result here. Now, I've seen some beautiful imagery, and I know that once you start doing that, using this kind of method, you'll see people using this a lot, where they've actually done the foliage and perhaps the bricks that kind of outlines only, on most of their drawing, and then only a certain area do they take to detail, and it's really effective. I definitely recommend you trying it. What we're doing today is just a small segment of this drawing, but you could literally draw out in outlines or quasi outlines almost all of the scene that you see here, the total photograph, um, and then put detail only where you want the story to be told. And what would happen is that all of that kind of outliney stuff would become a texture on the paper. It would lend itself to the scene, but it wouldn't actually compete. Just as when you fill everything in with pencil, you sort of give an overall texture that isn't as noticeable. You can do the exact same thing with pencil that's just outlining. I know that that'll appeal to some of you guys who really like drawing in outlines. The secret is, however, to keep it light and to keep it relatively uniform, unless you're planning on doing what we're doing today, which is, kind of helping these outlines show the scene without putting everything in. The other thing that doing this sort of outline first and then start to, add in the darks only where they need to be. You need sort of like supporting characters for your main objects. The darks are sort of playing a supporting role. Is it allows you to do that nice thing where the edges of the drawing fade off into the paper. And a couple of people over the course of the summer have said to me, how do I deal with the edges? Sometimes we're doing blending or we're doing strokes in the background that we just sort of try to blend off artistically. We might come back with an eraser to kind of make that shape. But this particular method where we're just sort of doing outline and then we're using the darks and the other textures that we draw in as sort of supporting characters, um, that gives us an opportunity just to let our pencil strokes disappear off the edge and not worry about it. Today, time is going to do that for us. Now, I did go in on some things. I actually I was just drawing this quite small, um, and just turned my page around so that I could get some of the directional strokes I wanted on the watering can spout, around the edges of uh, the plant pots. So don't ever feel like you can't move your paper. Sometimes I will actually, because I like to draw on a board, I'll just tape my paper to a board and then I'll move the whole board around because I could have that in my lap or propped up on my bigger drawing table or whatever I like to do. But I don't like the paper fixed to the point that I can't actually move it at all. Because why not use it's drawing is difficult enough. Why make it any harder on yourself? And so I wanted to share with you also a quote that I heard in one of the books I was reading. I can't remember whether it was an Andrew Loomis. I think it might have been at the beginning of Andrew Loomis's creative illustration book. Um, but he quotes someone, and I'll try to find out who exactly it was, as saying that it takes 3 days to learn to paint and 30 years to learn to draw. So I thought that would appeal to you guys because um, I know what he means. That putting paint actually on a canvas is not a really difficult thing to do in terms of, yeah, you need to worry about values, you need to worry about color, but you can actually, paint something with that basic information relatively quickly. Will it be a good painting? That's a different subject. But drawing is the subtle exploration using a limited set of tools, and really having to look at a scene and interpret in only basically two colors what you're doing. If you draw very well, you can definitely learn to paint in 3 days. I think it might be a little bit difficult if you've never drawn at all. But I wanted to share that with you because during the course of the classes, we're on class number 17 now. We've already done a couple of auditions, some rough sketching, some more complete drawing, some stuff on toned paper, figurative, still life, landscape, subject matter. And we haven't even scratched the surface, as I'm sure you can tell. Not so much of technique. I think that really, once you get started, basically manipulating the tools you have, which are pencils, in various different ways, stroke length, how hard you're pressing, where you're holding the pencil to get different effects, how you're sharpening the lead. I think we're already kind of taking all of that stuff as far as it can go, but then it's the combinations. It's how you do it. It's how you hold the pencil, what you think is important, how many lines you think it requires to define something. That's the part, that's the 30-year part. um, and and that is why I continue to encourage people to draw all the time, because you'll never stop learning new things, figuring out interesting ways to incorporate something that's going on, solving problems, solving challenges and getting beyond them and making something that works. You'll always have something that worked in a drawing to take on to the next drawing. You'll also have plenty of drawings where you're like, I enjoyed myself for that hour or two, but I don't like it, and I'm going to just tear it up and not worry about it. You'll have those other drawings where you're like, okay, I'm not really sure how I feel about it. I'm going to put it in a drawer and forget about it. And a few years later, when you see it again, you're like, wow, that was not quite so bad. So let me move on to the next stage, which I actually think is as far as I got this time. So what I started doing at this point, as I mentioned, I was adding in darks in the focal area using directional lines. I held the tip of my pencil away, held the pencil away from the tip to get my lines under control. When I used the beveled end of the pencil, I don't really do that because I want that consistent pressure. But when I started doing some kind of hatching. I thought I'd just hatch in one direction to sort of show the idea of veined leaves that were going off in different directions, because we have all of these different planes that we're dealing with. And sometimes when you use lines that are spaced apart, hatching, it's a really great way to sort of indicate what happens on foliage without trying to draw the actual veins out. So once again, at this point, what's starting to happen probably is that you're probably starting to go, oh, I need to fill in a bit more stuff. I left a lot of things in outline, but I really want to define that bean leaf a little bit more. And I really think, the plant in the pot, there are a lot of lights and darks going on there. What am I going to do? And so this is when it becomes really challenging not to fill everything in and to leave. For example, I left the mint leaves behind the watering can. I did not fill all of that stuff in because I was like, okay, if I leave anything alone at all, I need to leave some of the larger plant, some of those mint leaves, some of those grasses. Uh, you know, I liked that little shape of the Queen Anne's lace. I like the tomato plant. I like the beans. And I also moved the beans over inwards. I wanted some more trailing down vines. I just decided I'll just draw them like that and I'll just move the whole thing in. It made to me a tighter and more compact type of drawing. So the next thing I considered was, as I was drawing this, I was feeling my way through the texture. And what does that mean? That sounds sort of artsy. What it meant was that I tried to think about bricks while I drew bricks, and I tried to think about grasses as I drew grasses, and I tried to think about, the nature of bean vines, the nature of bricks. So for me, one of the things that I noticed was that when you try to draw a brick, especially when the edges are crumbled and rounded, you can actually use more than one pencil stroke, not all on top of each other, just sort of, you know, it's almost as you refine the shape of the brick, the shape, you can leave the previous lines there. um, because they actually that sort of represents kind of the roundness, the unevenness of what you're dealing with. I used short little strokes in places where I saw some more divots. I didn't worry in this particular, what we were up to today about the chalking or the lack of chalking on the edges of the bricks. Um, I just really concentrated on the light and dark form, of what was falling where. But it leads me back to this whole thing about textures and drawing textures. My feeling is that when we're drawing, we're not necessarily trying to go, okay, I need to represent a brick 100% as this is a terracotta block of some sort. What I want is I just want these things to be a vehicle for the drawing as it is. Um, there's also a similarity between the texture of the terracotta and the texture of the plant pots. as one takes a drawing like this on to further steps, you have to go, okay, what am I going to do about that? Perhaps I could make the plant pots look smoother and I can make the bricks look rougher, or I can add more detail into the plant pot and less into what's going on behind. So this sort of decision making happens best when you just sort of try with your pencil to emulate the the feeling. You know, a brick is rough. It has an uneven texture. It doesn't have the smooth lines of the surface of a leaf, for example. So in that case, I'm going to draw it in a different manner. Perhaps I'm going to use a different pencil. Perhaps I'm going to just be a little more jagged, a little less defined, whatever it happens to be. I also then wanted, however, to show the dark areas on some of these bricks. And so I did end up falling back into my usual favorite type of hatching to sort of, show the darkness and the lightness. I haven't pumped this up yet to show the super darks and the super lights because I'm still just working my way through the idea of the foliage. What I did was I then sat back and I said to myself, did I make too many marks? So I thought to myself, what I would like to do in order to take this drawing further, and I probably will do this after the class, and I'll include it with the PDF and at the end of the video for people who are going to be watching this later, is I think I would like to now make the decision about how perhaps to define those plant pots a little bit more. I do want them to stand out from the bricks. I don't want to put less texture on my bricks. I like my bricks the way they are, but that does mean I have to then make some decisions about what's going on. I also decided, I really like leaving the plants in the plant pots to have quite a bit of this area that isn't drawn in at all. I really like having those mint leaves defined back there with no drawing. I really do like the Queen Anne's lace being defined with no drawing in there as well. So what does that mean for everything else that I'm doing? And so I think that I'd probably leave the top of the watering can open just like I did here. But I think that it would be then nice if I'm going to have certain areas open like that to perhaps add some more directional lines flowing around horizontally, excuse me, around the edge of the watering can to sort of emphasize that roundness, probably not going too far or getting too crazy with that. But then pumping up the darks that are really the super darks, the darks in the soil in the larger pot, the darks behind the watering can that show off those mint leaves. Perhaps I got started with some directional lines, for some of the foliage that's behind the watering can and that's behind the larger pot. And, maybe I would continue that. So I feel like this is a really good place to stop an audition because I know where I'm going to be going from here. I know what the next steps can be, but I don't need to overwork it at this point. I think also that when you're drawing something that's small like this, it's very useful. It's almost like an overly developed notan because once again, you're trying to follow your ideas through a scene, a very, very complex scene, trying to draw less rather than draw more. Can you imagine what would happen if we had started trying to add texture into the mint leaves, add texture into the plant that we see in the large pot, add all of the texture into the bricks, draw in more, using darks and such like that, the tomato plant, it would become a really indistinct mess. By having this kind of structure here of not drawing things, and perhaps even drawing less even than I have, I could perhaps have less in the bean plants or less going on in the grasses behind the watering can. Not less from a point of view of amount of stuff, but less in terms of less graphite going down. Anyway, this is one of those techniques that I really want you to practice in most of the drawing that you do. Where can you not put any particular texture at all, or not put any lines at all? As you know, the Martha's Vineyard Drawing Prize just wrapped up its entries. The deadline was on Monday, and judging is going on this week, and we'll be announcing the winners on Saturday. And then I'll also be posting most of the entries on the Instagram showcase have two different accounts, one for the Martha's Vineyard Drawing Prize and one for the Martha's Vineyard Drawing Prize Showcase. And so those artists who don't mind, I go ahead and put all of the entries up online. Some people don't want me to do that, and I give them the opportunity to say one way or the other. But you'll see that there are a number of artists in particular who use this idea of not drawing all over the drawing as a way to really pump up their finish. So I'm just going to move on at this point and just sort of do a little bit of an overview with you. I'm going to go back to that picture in a minute for those of you guys who are still drawing. So just very quickly, this is sort of how we progressed today. We started with the notan. We went to the outlines. We kind of got the drawing laid out pretty accurately, but let our pencil just kind of wander around the foliage, not drawing everything in, and then started adding it a little bit of detail, adding a little bit of texture, and then continuing with that idea, but still having those light areas remain light. And what that does is it gives the whole drawing a little bit of pizzazz. Whereas if we filled everything in, we wouldn't get that kind of interesting light and dark combination that we see here. So I'm just going to move back here so that you guys can finish for the next few minutes, just finish wrapping this up. So overall, when it comes to how we approach our drawing, I have a tendency, as you know very well, to like to start from light and dark and looking at those particular patterns. But it's not the only way to do that. You can start completely from outline and decide what you're going to add detail to and what you're not. I make those decisions about what I like to and what I don't like to based on contrast, because it's just what I can see. It's kind of what I see that's most obvious. Other people might make a completely different decision. So what would that look like? A different decision might be about the types of texture. Your eye might be drawn to certain textures that you want to show and certain textures that you don't want to show. So you might do a drawing, for example, where you're not interested in the least in any of these bricks. You might just have them indicated as outlines, but instead all of your detail and all of your texture goes into the foliage and into the watering can, the plant pot, the both plant pots and the scissors. You might do a little bit more work there, but perhaps everything that's terracotta exists only as a structure for you to draw beautiful foliage on top. Perhaps you do a drawing, for example, where everything that's in terracotta is just in black and white in graphite, and you add colored pencil to the foliage and nowhere else, so that all of your different greens come out and nothing else. Maybe you put a little bit of blue in the watering can. So this is what I mean, that even though I've got my own way of going into a drawing and what I'm looking for as an end result, by realizing that a drawing can be interpreted different ways. Everything doesn't have to be filled in. Our job isn't to sit here and reproduce this photograph by any means whatsoever. Our job, if we have one, is to look at something like this that we find attractive for some reason. In this case, it tells to me a little story of being transplanted, about finding a new home, about growing in your new location. To me, that's the story I'm trying to tell. But you could easily look at this as well and just say, hey, this is a really beautiful layout. I just want to draw this in my own way and not worry about Elizabeth's little story. My story, so to speak, is, gosh, look at the wonderful varieties of greens and foliage and textures. And that's what I want to concentrate on. And I don't actually care about bricks at all. Or you might think the opposite. You might be like, wow, I really like bricks. I like all those directional lines I could put in there. I like the idea of working on the texture. Maybe I'll pull in some, red Conte crayon or orangey Conte crayon, to help me on that. And maybe all the foliage just stays in outline. And I don't put any, detail in it at all, but I just try to show there's a complexity to the exterior of this scene just through outline. Once again, we're not trying to reproduce photographs. We're just trying to draw a scene that is interesting. And there are many, many ways to approach that. One of these ways is how I do it, by looking at the darks and kind of going in that way. But I love this business about not having to draw everything, about allowing some areas to remain just the color of the paper. This is kind of like And perhaps I don't think it's spoken about enough. We tend to talk about on toned paper that, the paper plays a part. It has a role to play. Don't do too much drawing, just do the darks and the lights, and the paper takes care of the rest. Absolutely the same thing goes on white paper, but we can take that even further by saying that the white paper can play a part beyond color. It's not just about leaving everything light, that is the white paper. It's also about saying that we can designate the lightness of the paper to act as structure, a structure within our drawing, that we decide, that we artists decide based on, the flow, what's interesting to us, what the story is, uh, anything we want. It's completely up to you what can be light and dark. So a good way to practice this is to draw anything, your coffee cup, the stuff on the kitchen table, a plant or whatever. Start by just doing as we always do, kind of like an outline, get your angles right, and then look at it and go, okay, I'm going to try to put the least amount of graphite down. What actually needs graphite? What would make this interesting? If it's a plant, you might go, well, I'd like the darker leaves to have some stuff going on. And then the lighter leaves, I'll just leave as they are. And you might do a few leaves and go, okay, how did that work? And just assess that. But backing in like that, backing into that idea of how much graphite we're putting down, what it does is it stops you from just sort of doing, I think, what all of us naturally do. We put the paper down, we get our outline going, and then we start filling everything in. How many textures? How many ways can we hold the pencil? How many types of pencils can we use? Um, and it really doesn't necessarily make for a better drawing. It makes for a very well worked drawing, but it doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily interesting. It doesn't necessarily have some zing to it. So back in the day when I was learning how to quilt, from a book that I got from a quilter named Ginny Beyer, one of the things that she stressed was that in the quilt blocks, that she liked to have some very darks and some very lights because it added some pop, to have that interplay. And even if you work in all in lights or you like mostly darks or whatever it happens to be, it's that range, I think, that makes the difference. And I do really think that using the white of the paper to add a little pop to your drawing within the drawing, not just around the edges, but within the drawing. Um, so I call it reserving the whites or reserving the highlights, reserving certain areas of the drawing. And I know that people who do watercolor are really familiar with this. You want that white of the paper to come through, so you leave certain areas completely open. That same thing applies to drawing. You can just reserve certain areas. You can decide later you're going to fill them in, but it's a lot easier to do it that way than it is to come along and try to erase everything later, although that is possible. Okay, let's go ahead and wrap this up, and we'll just get to the last bit of the class. Okay, so concept. We've been talking every class this week about what the concept is, that your own story and interests are always a good starting point. So I'm transplanted numerous times through the course of my life to different places, and I also love gardening. So that really drew me to this image for us to draw. But anything that is your own story and your own interests are a really good starting point for any drawing that you want to do. Ordinary objects can symbolize large concepts. So if you were to talk about, somebody being a transplant and not at home, you could think perhaps of someone with suitcases, walking through an airport entry point or something like that, actually the physical moving, the actual transplanting of a human being. But you can also think of things like the other ways we use those words, synonyms basically for the concept, but symbolizing whatever the larger idea that we want is. So we talk about transplanting not only about people, but also transplanting when it comes to plants. So there you go. There's some symbols, a smaller symbol that tells the larger story. We don't have to always be exactly literal, even though we were talking about home. The small arrangement can tell the larger story. So the symbols can either be really obvious. There's nothing wrong with drawing somebody with suitcases coming through an airport. That's great too. That also tells that transplant story. But for us, we were also talking about home, and I tend to think of most people are doing their transplanting of their plants where they live in some form or another. And so that's what made me think of the home connection. It's completely up to you, though, how you do this kind of interpretation. For the Martha's Vineyard Drawing Prize this year, home has also been the topic. And it's been interesting to me to see, how people have made the connection to the idea of home. Some people, it's a stretch. They've got a drawing and they're trying to, to say, hey, this drawing is going to work and this is the connection to home. But others, you can really see that, even though it might not be something I would have thought of immediately, sure, I can understand what that connection is for you. It's completely personal. So when it comes to technique, you now have the ability to mix and match drawing techniques of all different types. I'm sure you're starting to find your own go-to, that you'd like to use all the time. I definitely find that certain of my pencils that I take around with me are definitely getting used more than others. So we've got line work, that's like outlines, hatching, lively line work where we're putting more than one line down to, symbolize action or roughness or whatever it happens to be. Directional lines that follow form, for example, going around the watering can, going around the plant pots. Loose pencils traveling around an area, then adding in detail only as needed. Perfect for foliage, perfect for things like rocks, pebbles, anything that you've got a lot of that you don't want to necessarily draw individually, but you like the flow and the texture. This is a great way to start your way into that drawing. Beveled pencils can help as well. They're a nice go-to when you're starting to decide just how much detail to add in. The academic drawing using pointed leads and small clear hatching is great when you get to the point of, perhaps you're past the audition or near the end of it, and now you're ready to think about how you're really going to do the subtleties that you were practicing in your audition. How are you going to do that? If I were going to do this drawing at a larger scale, I'd start off with my beveled pencils just to get that graphite down and to give me a bit of underlying texture. But some of those areas around the plants where I wanted to show off the areas I left white, I would probably want to get in there with those nice points, do some of that academic drawing with either little hatches going different directions or little circular motions to really create a very soft and very uniform kind of finish. And then on white paper, just as I mentioned a few minutes ago, use the white of the paper. It helps you emphasize your focal point and tell the story. It means you don't have to draw everywhere, all over the page, so that some of it can be very interesting and eye-catching. And it can move your eye around. If you've got a drawing scene that has a lot of midtones and darks, such as that scene in the garden, by deciding to just move some things into the lights. Doesn't matter if they actually are light or not. If you just like it because of the form or because it's sort of light and you can make it lighter, that's the way to go about it. Okay, let me go ahead and stop sharing. All right, super. Well done, everyone. I know that was something new and interesting, but hopefully you enjoyed it. There is a ton of application for that and certainly worth experimenting with. And I also want to talk about what we're going to be doing next week. So next week, I want you to come ready to try new things. So we'll be using all the techniques that we've used throughout the summer, but also now thinking about, hey, when we are drawing and we want to just add stuff in that doesn't even exist and that we want to, or put things together that don't actually exist in front of us together, how are we going to do that? So we'll run through some exercises next week that hopefully will be fun and allow you to do that. And then our final class, number 19, will be a very peaceful, kind of evocative, atmospheric landscape. And it'll be another good place for us to try actually some of what you learned today and also some of the other techniques from the other 18 classes all put together. So I'm looking forward to see you next week for a little bit of memory and imagination applied to drawing. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. I'll be back in the studio next week and I'll be looking forward to it. All right, everybody.
Thank you.